Hello, and welcome back to the Authentic Creative, expanding our capacity to feel good. I'm so excited because I've got this beautiful woman here, this amazing, talented, dynamic, incredibly prolific woman here, Carey Wallace. And when she popped on, I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just listening to your music." And she said, "Oh, that's fun." And I asked her if I could play a little bit. So I'm going to introduce you guys, but I just want to play a piece of Carrie's music. Here we go. Sweetheart, all your enemies are only in your mind. That is gorgeous.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing it. I don't get to talk about my music very much. So that is absolutely delightful.
I'm so excited to put your music into some of my breathwork classes. That is very inspiring.
Well, there's a lot of breath work in music. So,
Exactly, exactly. Okay, guys, so Carrie Walsh, just so you guys can understand who we're talking to, is an author, songwriter, of course, as you've just witnessed, an artist based in Brooklyn. I love it. I love New York. I used to live in New York. Celebrated for her ability to weave creativity, which is what we're all about here, faith, and discipline into a profound exploration of the human experience. As the founder of the creative discipline class, first of all, I just have to stop and say that's incredible because I have so much reverence for putting those words together, creative and discipline, right?
mm-hmm.
Creativity is, it needs a framework and it needs consistency. So we'll
Amen.
get into it. So she empowers individuals from all walks of life to nurture their inspiration and build sustainable creative habits. This is so good. Her latest book, The Discipline of Inspiration, The Mysterious Encounter with God at the Heart of Creativity. Guys, it's coming out in January, so you can pre-order, yes?
Yeah, yeah, coming soon, very soon, the
Next month,
second.
next month, next month, delves into the elusive spark of inspiration, its origins, its demands, and how we can cultivate it more deeply in our lives, blending historical insights with practical strategies. Carrie offers tools that resonate with artists and non-artists alike, making inspiration more accessible and transformative. Praised by luminaries such as Patti Smith, Christian Wyman, Carrie's work eloquently articulates the intricate dance between faith and creativity, solidifying her role as a leading voice in the conversation about art and spirituality. I mean, I'm just head tingles feeling them all the feels right now because this is just so up my alley and the listeners here, it's so aligned. So I can't wait to hear. First of all, where did you grow up?
So I grew up mostly in small towns in Michigan,
Okay.
largely farm towns. So at my high school, most of the pranks involved farm animals.
Yeah.
But have spent the last almost 20 years in New York, mostly in Brooklyn. So
Okay. Okay. And Brooklyn and New York are like creative hubs. And there's just so much to draw from, so much inspiration to draw from when you're living there. It's just brilliant. I love it.
yes, yep,
Yeah.
yep.
So, what was it like transitioning from that kind of farm life you just mentioned into this creative hub of New York?
Well, there's great things about both of them, right? There was a lot of time, a lot of space in Michigan in the Detroit area. If you wanted to start a band, there was like free practice room, like usually in somebody's house, right? And in New York, you have to pay people to even play with you, which is, so there's really different opportunities, but the people who you have to pay are oftentimes world-class musicians themselves, so they are a lot easier to find. At the same time, some of the most extraordinary artists I've ever known are like lurking in the backwoods somewhere, and nobody knows about them, but the people who are lucky enough to actually personally know them. So I see a lot of value in both. For me, it was really wonderful to be in the mix in Brooklyn of the things that are actually going out into the broader world, and also the sort of the competition in New York. Not between artists, but just in terms of who gets your attention and who gets your time. It makes the shop windows beautiful, right? Because you have to do so much more to like earn that like really fragmented attention, but at the same
Mhm.
time, it pushes you way beyond the
Yeah.
bounds of where you would be in a smaller place. So I think that that like how much farther, how much more jet fuel can you use, was a really useful um, sort of ethic for me in the New York art scene.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. So there's benefit to both, and I love how you touched upon just that you can find people that are incredibly talented that just have no interest or no longing, or they just haven't found the ambition
Yep.
to go into the more competitive spaces. But that, of course, in the competitive spaces, there's just so much more competition. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah.
some of the people in those competitive spaces are just competitive. They're not actually talented. They're
Mm.
just like,
They're just ambitious
so they're
and
just really good at competing. They have like a grit,
yeah.
so they're people who move forward because they have that. And I think, it's a real, I'm sure the people on who are your listeners are really thinking about this and dealing with this. How do you have the grit that it takes to move forward? And there's a separate grit just to keep making things, whether people are paying attention to you or not. But how does that balance with sort of like the sensitivity and the openness and the thin skin that allows things to come in and really get a hold on you so that you can make something wonderful? So I don't have an
Yes.
answer to that. I just acknowledging the question there.
Okay, I love
So
how you're talking about the thin skin because as an artist, there's this dichotomy, right? Like we need to be vulnerable and open and have a thin skin and be flowing and in flow and
yep.
vibing and like very feminine energy
Interesting.
and also what you talk about with your book is this discipline and with your class is this discipline and these habits.
Yeah. Well, and maybe I lied when I said I didn't have an answer. I think actually the way through is habit, is discipline, right? So I think that you can, the way to sort of nurture yourself and nurture others in their creativity is to make a pattern of it. And that can allow you to dip in and out of it. It can allow you to build not just for a few weeks or like under a deadline, but for a year, for a decade, on the same project. And the discipline of inspiration is over a decade long project in my life. And I was only able, like, I couldn't have done that in the heat of my first emotion around that idea, right? Like, I needed a pattern that would allow me to make it, to come back to it, and I actually think that building that pattern gives you some of the grit that it takes to try to find a place in the world, which also like a lot of times those stories get told as like luck, the sort of infinite luck of like, oh, this person,
Mhm.
this overnight success. I actually don't up close know any stories of overnight success. There's always a pattern of just trying to move, trying to take the next step. And I think when you learn how to do that in your creation, you're actually more equipped to do that in terms of finding its place in the world when you have created something.
When I started this podcast a few years ago, I used to mostly interview actors, and
Ah,
what I would ask them, and it was called the actor wound. And
mm,
what,
yeah.
what I would ask them, which I'm being called to ask you now, is what I find so interesting is what becomes our mission oftentimes comes from our pain point. And so I would
Mm.
ask them, like, what was the thing that you feel like was the wound that catapulted you or kept drawing you into this creative process of wanting whatever you're wanting. So I'm curious because I think it's a really interesting inroad and I know it's really vulnerable and I just met you, but like for me, for example, seventh grade,
Hmm.
my dad left, my
Mm.
best friend left and my other
Mm,
best friend
mm-mm.
stopped wanting to be friends. And I remember having to eat, not having to, but choosing to eat lunch a couple times in the girls' bathroom stall.
Yeah,
And I was a leader, quotes leader. I didn't want to follow the popular girls, but I so wanted to belong.
sure.
And so like our art and the courage to create our art and that courage to and that discipline to like get to the next step as you're talking about and to have that grit, I think comes from those pain points a lot of the time.
Mm, hmm hmm
I mean, of course, there's also creation from love and inspiration and faith in God. But just to touch upon the pain point, like what would that maybe be for you? Maybe you haven't talked about this publicly before. I don't know.
I don't, I was thinking about this as you were talking, and I don't know. My life as a creator really does come, you were just talking about a sense of call. And I think much of that has flowed out of a sense of call. But with this particular book that we're talking about today, The Discipline of Inspiration, that flows out of a really deep pain that I was actually getting teary when I was thinking about it, which is watching other people who are wonderful artists stop making.
Mm.
And watching so many talented people not even try at all. And so I was, I wrote this book because I was creating this program, the Creative Discipline Program, to give people a habit that they could take with them through life, that they could find a way to make art in the context of their daily life, whether anyone was ever listening to them at all, or whether the whole world was listening to them, or they felt that way, which can be an equally kind of like paralyzing
Yeah.
experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's different
So
demons. Yeah.
exactly. Or maybe they're the same ones, they just act different in different places. Who knows? But but I have, I'm someone who really loves art, who has felt like my life has been saved by people I've never met because of the words that they have written on pages or the
Oh,
things that they have sung. And it causes me, I'm still like weepy about it, the number of people who have talent, or not even talent, but desire, right? Because the most talented people don't always make the most interesting things. And I also think there's an enormous amount of talent that people themselves don't recognize that they have,
right. Right.
and and I think it's actually really tragic the degree to which we've decided that all art needs to happen on a national scale and like all acting needs to be like on a screen in a movie theater or on Broadway. Like we had these wonderful local traditions before this. And one of the things I think about a lot is that when you had a hit song, even 100 years ago, it would sell 1 million copies of sheet music because people were taking that home and reproducing it and in like not just by themselves, but like that was a communal activity. I mean, there's a whole bunch about like how we relate to each other and how we relate to art and that. But when I started creating that program,
You're
I was
fascinating. I love this. I'm in heaven. Keep going.
well, it's so nice to meet you. And I feel like there could be a much longer conversation here than we're even going to get on this podcast, but
For
it's
sure.
very, very nice to meet you now. Um, so I was trying to create a curriculum for this program. The program as it currently exists is now nothing but habit creation. Like I'm not having anybody read anything. It's just like you make promises about what you're going to do and you support each other and in like keeping those promises to wear the groove of a habit of creating art into your daily life, whatever that daily life is. But originally I was like, well, I need a curriculum. I need to like have all these voices speaking into this. And I didn't want the voices like if you go out looking for books on art, you will notice that many of the people who have written the most famous books did not make the most interesting art, right? And so I was like, I
Mm.
don't know how interested I am in people who never made a movie I wanted to see, right? So what I was looking for in these in this curriculum was the voices by artists on art, right? So I looked at and most of the greats have not like taken time off from making movies to like write a book or making paintings to write a book. They have like written letters to their brother, or they have like done an interview in the Paris Review or a Rolling
Hmm.
Stone, or they've like agreed to be interviewed for a book of songwriters on songwriting or a book of dancers on dance.
Hmm.
And so I went through all of that stuff. And what I found, and I was interested in this big realm of things like the artist's life. Do we have to be unhappy?
Mm.
The artist character, do we have to be a jerk? Like the purpose of art, the definition of art, and the artist's religious experience, because that is something that is important in my life. At least faith is important in my life. And what I found was like everybody disagreeing about everything, like diametric opposites. And on base
Interesting.
and everybody, it's like if Tolstoy and Toni Morrison are disagreeing with each other, like who wins, right? It's like
Hmm.
it's not clear like who has
It's
the
like having a
authority.
discussion about like love or God or spirituality. It's like there's so
Right.
many inroads and there's so many experience, personal, unique experiences.
Yeah.
And also you're talking about so many different types of art.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there was one through line. So like
Okay.
in this big mix, there was one through line. And I do believe that it's all like, I do believe that it's all coming from the same place. That's like the fundamental, idea of this book. And I actually find I wonder if your listeners may also feel like this, that like I actually at this point learn a lot more from actors than I do from writers. Like I'm pretty good at my craft. Like I don't need the sort of like basic sort of like apprenticeship that I needed when I was younger. And
Hmm.
so I learn an enormous amount from people who like understand what it's like to be an artist and like have a different perspective is often really rich for me. Um,
Studying human behavior is really what actors do, and studying emotion and expressing emotion in their authentic self in real time. And
yeah.
that's fascinating to you.
Well, yeah, but I also think that like that description could be used of dancers. It could be used of novelists. It could be, it's like harder to cram an architect in there, but maybe, this idea of, and I think a lot of definitions of art, I think a lot of them fail or are incomplete, but I think a lot of them also work across many, many genres of art, right? But the one place they all agreed was on the sensation of inspiration. And they were very consistently describing that as something that came from beyond them, that appeared to have a distinct personality, that wanted them to do things they would never have thought of themselves, that were things that they maybe didn't even want to do themselves. And that if they didn't respond to it, it might go someplace else. It had like its own energy and trajectory. So it wasn't just internal, it was moving through them, right? And they universally were reaching for religious language to describe it, even if what they had to say was feels like transcendence, feels like God, couldn't possibly be, must be some artifact of the consciousness, but I was like, and a number of them actually did, like from all kinds of backgrounds, um, did ascribe it to God as they understood God. And I was like, what where do we get if we follow this testimony, right? Like, where can this lead us as artists? Where, if we're people of faith, where can it lead us as people of faith? And so that was the kernel of this book. But it starts with something that's been a real fundamental thing for me, which is wanting to see other people make more art. And I don't say other artists very deliberately, because I think there are a lot of people capable of making wonderful art who have not accepted that name for themselves yet. But I actually do believe that all of us are fundamentally artists in some way.
Yeah, we all are creative. If you go into a classroom and there's 5-year-olds there, no one's
Yes.
gonna say I'm not creative. They're all creative. It's just, it's same with our clairvoyancy or our intuition, right?
Mm,
It's like
yeah.
that connection to source gets invalidated sometimes in certain ways, and some for more people than others. And other people, it's just stronger, or they have more people sort of supporting them and guiding them and elevating them
Yes.
to be continue to be connected. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a few questions. So, inspiration and
Sure.
creativity. Can you describe, this is a fun question, can you
Okay.
describe the wildest or most surprising moment of inspiration that you've ever had?
Um, that's a good question. I mean, honestly, it may have been the very strong call that I felt to write this book. So I started writing this book when I was like, I had just published my first novel, and I was like, um, in my early 30s. And I just thought, you don't write a book about like the source of inspiration at this point in your life. Like you do this when you're like 65, right? Or somebody like you do this when you have a proven track record and you're a grand dame of some, of some kind, if it, if you ever get to that point. But I felt a very strong sense that it had to be done and it had to be done at that point. And I went ahead and did it and had to make a lot of sacrifices in order to make that happen. And it was very much when I say something that you didn't want to do, like I knew what the next obvious step was in my career. This was not it. And there were like real consequences for not taking that obvious next step. But now that it is coming out, I feel very happy that I did it when I did it. And I don't know if I could do it now if I had waited to do it now, right? So
So I, of course, am curious when you say sacrifices and consequences. I'm so curious, is that very personal? Is it relationship based? That what was the sacrifice and the consequence?
some of it was financial. There was no money, right? Like
Okay.
there was no money for this. And so I actually cashed in a very small retirement account. And so that account did not grow, right? It took a long time to replace. And when I replaced it, I did not replace all of what would have grown. I had not made that sacrifice. And some of it was, you can never guess, like nobody knows what's going to happen in an artistic career. It's like one gigantic crapshoot.
Yeah.
But there was a very obvious next step for me to take in terms of what my next book would be. It should have been like a literary commercial confection for adult people, mostly women, right? And instead I wrote this like theological tome on creativity as somebody who nobody was particularly interested in those opinions on my opinions about this. So when that, and if you're a writer, you're dependent on if you're trying to make money selling books, you're dependent on the sale of the next book. And
Mhm.
it took over 10 years to find a place for it. So there was like a real derailment of what the obvious next thing would have been to do in a number of ways.
And that going against a logic brain for you and going against your financial wisdom for you really came because of this connection that you had to God or source or your faith. And like, I am being asked by, what was it for you? What was the calling? How did you know?
It just um, people have asked me that before. To me, it feels like it's a piece of information that you had. Like if somebody tells you something, then you know it, right? Like if I tell you my favorite color is blue, like you now know that, right? And for me, it was like I suddenly knew this thing without anybody having told me, right?
You just knew it in your bones.
I knew that
Okay.
I was supposed to, and it was a growing feeling. It lasted months, and I resisted it for like, I had this idea for years before I even started writing it, right? So, and it went from being an idea to like a real, like a prompt, like a barb in my soul. So, yeah, so I
Hmm.
went ahead and wrote it.
Would you get up sometimes in the middle of the night and write pieces of it? Would it come directly first thing in the morning when you'd wake up? Like, how did it start to come through?
So I will write down ideas whenever I have them. That can happen at any point through the day. And I do have like a book by my bed that I write things down in, if I have ideas at night. And the ideas came all different ways. One of the things that's interesting about this particular idea to me was like how far it went and how many directions, right? It just felt like when I first started thinking about it, it was like, does this idea ever stop? Like are there any parts of life that are not touched by it? And the conclusion I came to was no. But I had a sense that
Wow.
this is very, very large. Like as a, you pull the string of an idea and you're like, oh, yeah, there's a novel here. And it was like, no, this is like, this is the whole world. I'm talking about the whole world here. But
Easy,
then,
easy. You
yeah,
can write that. Yeah. But
but
somehow you accomplished it.
yeah, well, and then the process was a process of discipline. And the discipline was really important because it was too big of a project. I would have like if I tried to write it just in the grip of like, actually, I think this is a misuse of the word inspiration, but people talk about only working when they're inspired, which I think is actually they're saying excited. To
Uh,
me, inspiration is much more precise. Inspiration is when when God or the source, is actually like present and you are receiving it.
Hmm.
That's what I'm interested in people getting more. I also think there's like sort of like a creative foment that people get in, and it's like it's fun. You feel like you're a genius, and you're like, everything you're doing is great. And I think that's actually sort of a dangerous place to create from all the time. And I also think that for a project like this, it's like 55,000 words long, and it's incredibly there's not fluff in it. Like all the thoughts were like um there's just not like lines of dialogue that it's easy to get through. It's like a bunch of thoughts.
Hmm.
And I hope that it's also like easy and maybe even beautiful to read at this point. But it was a really big project to get on the page, and I really needed to do it 2 hours a day and not do more than that so that I
Mm.
had the energy to come back to it. It's the hardest thing that I ever wrote, and it wasn't fun to write. Like it was not actually an art project. It was a labor of love, and it was an argument, and it was like all these other things, but it did not have the payoff of creation, which I was really used to having every day, right? Like I was
Interesting.
and I do think that I hope that God was operational in it, right? Like I hope that God was speaking through it. But it didn't have this sense of like, I get to make a whole new world, or I get to discover a new melody. It was like, how do you take these ideas and like put them in a form that other people can grasp and engage with themselves?
I
So,
remember, this is beautiful to hear the truth of this, because I think we have these fallacies, and what you're saying is the truth. It's like this was hard, and I had to discipline myself. I had to titrate it, and I had to be specific and deliberate, but it was also all of these things that were connecting everything, and it covered the whole span of every piece of thought that you've ever had kind of situation. I just keep thinking of The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, of course, because that was my awakening to and
amazing.
God and creativity together when I was 19.
Mm,
As an
mm,
actor, my acting teacher was like, read this book. And then that's continues to be on my desk.
yeah.
Continues to, so it's so much, I'm sure you've heard this before, so much of what you talk about is related to her work.
Yeah, and I also think it is I think that that's an amazing book, and that it has been I know so many people who've had transformative experiences with it, and I also think it stops short of where I hope the discipline of inspiration goes. I think she makes a
It's like the
connection.
starter kit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And she doesn't mine out everything that it could mean. And I hope that that is part of what I've done in this book is be like, once you get to that point, what else is there beyond it? And I think there's a whole world, like a whole world beyond it. So,
Now what? Yeah. So practical tools for listeners. So if someone listening feels stuck creatively, what is a simple step that they can take today to reconnect with the inspiration?
to me, one of the most effective things to do is to just make time on the calendar for it, and to keep showing up for that time, regardless of how you feel about it. And my experience is, if you're feeling stuck, you are conversely also feeling the desire to do something, right? So you've got like people who aren't trying to do anything creatively don't feel stuck. So you're actually already in kind of a great place if you're feeling
I
stuck.
love that way of looking at it because it's so
Right?
true. You wouldn't think that you are stuck if you didn't have something that was dying to come out of you that you were just somehow squashing because you're scared or what have you. It's like, oh, I also keep thinking of that book, The Courage to Create by Rollo May.
I have
Yeah.
not read that one. I have not read that one. But
Yeah.
what does it make you think of?
Just that to do anything, it takes courage to create anything
Yeah.
because
Yep.
you're saying I matter. You're saying
Yeah.
something that's inside of me matters enough to put it out consistently and enough to
Yep.
make it into something and then enough to show someone and say, look at this.
Yes. Yeah, and also to do all of that instead of like making money with that same time, right? It's like
Yeah.
there are which I think is a real thing. Or instead of like taking care of your kids, or instead of taking care, all the things that all the duties and pressures and
Oh,
responsibilities of life. So I think it can be very hard to take that time, but I also think that like all the rest of your life can benefit from taking that time. And I've been working with people for years doing this, and it's amazing to me. You know, I had a practice of 2 hours a day. I knew that that was really good for me as a writer. It gave me time to like get into the story and then have a good chunk of time after that. I got more done than if I did it just for an hour. If I tried to do 3 hours, I got burned out. You know, I ran all these experiments on myself. And I think that's a good pattern for almost anybody who can do it. But when I started running these programs, I saw people who definitely did not have two straight hours a day in their day. They hadn't like arranged their lives to do that. And I was taking jobs as like a waitress or a maid or whatever, so I could support this habit as a writer. And
Yeah.
but I watched people who were mothers. I watched people who had very demanding full-time jobs who really wanted to create things and would be like, I'm going to do this for 15 minutes a day. Or
Mhm.
I've got like, and I was like, you're crazy. What are you talking about? But I was like, it was my, what I was trying to do is release this in them. So I never said you're crazy. I was like, okay, that sounds great. Let's tell me next week if you do it, which is how the program works, right?
Mhm.
And what I saw repeatedly was that that if you use a little bit of that time, if you take a little bit of that time, um, it will grow. Like you will find ways to make room for it. So there was a woman who years ago I met with, and she was like, I'm just gonna try. I really want to write novels. I can do it for like an hour a day on Fridays. And I was like, I that's never going to work. But she started doing it and she loved it so much. She's like, I can get an hour and a half on Fridays. And I think I can get an hour on Tuesdays. That woman has now written and published more books than I have since we had that conversation.
Wow.
Right. So I really believe in the power of like a repeated appointment with yourself, and I think this is part of the power of, the morning pages or the artist date or whatever. But I think that the step you can take past that is I'm going to make this appointment to create, right? And I'm going to sit there and the deal that I make with myself when I set aside the time to work is I don't actually have to do anything with that time. I'm just not allowed to do anything else with it, right?
Hmm.
So I don't have to write any words at all, but I'm not allowed to like clean the house. I'm not allowed to like answer emails. I'm not allowed to like a lot of people, I'm not, this is what works for me, right? But a lot of people will be like, I'm going to read a book on craft or I'm going to whatever. And it's like none of that stuff. It's like you are just waiting to hear what comes next if you don't know, right? And I also think that in those times, I spent a lot of time early on, at least, doing something that was a lot like morning pages. I didn't have that name for it, but doing a lot of like, I'm just going to write down whatever I've got, right? Sometimes that's me clearing out my own mind before I get to whatever's on the page.
Yeah.
But I think to have like a sort of strictness, a commitment around making that time, and then a real openness about what can happen there, it has been incredibly fruitful for me and for a number of other people that I know.
I love the fact that you're talking about these everyday kind of normal human challenges that we have, which is like we gotta make money, we gotta pay the bills. And you're
Yep.
saying, I cleaned, I waitressed. I mean, you did whatever you had to do. And, my husband's a professional Hollywood screenwriter,
Nice.
and he used to work three jobs and
Yep.
on his break between being a genius at Apple at the Beverly Center, he would write.
Yeah.
And I also, so yes, it takes that kind of discipline and hard work, and the inspiration isn't just going to like come out of nowhere, and if you don't give it a place to go consistently.
Amen.
And then the other thing that I love is the fact that you're talking about that this woman, I mean, how inspiring is that you're saying you thought, okay, good luck with just doing those Fridays, that 1 hour, and you're saying
Yep.
she's written more than you. And it's like, well, guys, there's no excuse really, because if she can do that, and that's just a starting point. But like, if you can just do that one little commitment, like you're saying, 15 minutes or an hour once a week, it's like there really is no excuse, because that's anyone can fit in an hour somewhere.
Yeah. Well, and I hesitate. I think you're right that there's no excuse. I also think that like different people have really different boundaries on their lives, right? So like if you've got a single mom working two jobs, and with several kids, then I feel like the language of excuse is like
Yeah, it's harsh. But
is different. Um, but I do think that there are some of us who are absolutely making excuses, right? And it's
well,
useful
but
to
is that mom? Because here I'm just talking to my tough love to myself. Because it's like,
sure,
is that mom that you're talking about? Is she scrolling her phone for how many hours of the day when she's not
yeah,
engaged with whatever she's doing? And I know, I know for me, it's like, don't even look at how many hours I'm scrolling my phone
yeah,
and pretending that I'm working.
yeah, yeah.
Don't even, because I will be too embarrassed. It's like ridiculous because and we all do it. So I like that you say you don't have to be profoundly prolific when you're in that time that you've carved out for yourself. It's funny. It's also like the habit stacking thing, right? It's like, but what if, you do like every day you brush your teeth. So then after you brush your teeth, like what if every day you did 20 minutes of writing? It's like stacking the
Right.
habits. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And yeah. And I think that I mean I do think that not just artists, but everybody should be more sensitive to I think there's like doom scrolling. I think there's like checking out of life, like self-medicating through like all
Yep.
kinds of different things. But I also think that there is a real part of artists and all humans who like need to explore, who need to rest, who need to like, we don't actually just need to be productive all the time. So I think that there's something important about like carving out that space. Um, and holding it kind of sacrosanct, but
Sacred. Yeah.
to create. But also I think that like it is okay to like go down rabbit trails, right? Even on the internet sometimes, right? And it's okay to rest, and it's actually really okay and maybe super important to just sit and stare. And I actually think that's one of the usefulnesses of like I'm not researching during this time. I'm actually like I'm just going to sit and stare because there's so many things that happen when we sit and stare, right? That can't happen at any other point. So,
Yeah. So now you're talking about this practice of what we do when we're not writing.
yeah.
Yeah. So of like how we meditate or absorb or just be, simply be, or rest or like get inspired or fill the well, like all those things. So is there more in your course and in your book about ways in which you give yourself the sustenance to then be able to create?
Yeah, so the course there's actually kind of two courses, but the creative habits the lab or the creative discipline class is one that's really about looking at your whole life. So you are looking at like, are you getting enough rest, right? So what are you what will happen is people come in and the whole goal of the course is like make a little space um, to do some art in your life. And when people try to do that, they'll be like, I'm going to do it on Saturday morning. But if they haven't exercised or if they haven't slept well or if they had a fight with their husband the night before, right, they often come to that time and they actually don't have anything, right? So, and I think two things about this. I think one, we can create under any circumstances and we have to because the circumstances are never perfect, right? But I also think that art is an incredible litmus test for how we're doing in the rest of life because we have to bring our whole selves to it, and so it sheds a light on how our whole self is doing. It's very different than just like turning in copy for an ad agency, right? So um which people consistently do when they're exhausted and like have nothing in the tank at all, right? And that there are whole creative industries where that those are actually like the terms of engagement are like you never get any space, and I think those are not the places where the best things come out of, right? But I do think that making that space has a really deep power to show us what is going on in the rest of our lives. So that class illuminates the rest of your life just by virtue of forcing you to make art. And then the other class is actually working out. So the discipline of inspiration talks about the idea that inspiration comes from God, not from some like
Hmm.
some unknowable muse, but somebody who can be known and can be negotiated with in other ways. And when I ask the question of how can you get more of that? How can we open ourselves up more?
How can you invite more of the mysterious encounter with God into your creative process? That's the
Right.
question.
Right. And what I realized when I started thinking about that was that the practices that I had as a person of faith, like silence and solitude, and like, I'm not like good at any of these things, but I spent time in prayer. I sometimes did fasting. Community was really important to me. Poverty is a spiritual discipline. And I think the willingness to like not have money sometimes, involuntary poverty, I think is like a great evil that all of us should be working against. But I think voluntary poverty can be a source of power and a source of creative freedom for us. So I actually think that all of those spiritual disciplines are ways that we can shape the rest of both the rest of our lives, and our art can be shaped by any of those practices, and they can all be adapted into the life of an artist, like both into their lives as a human aside from their art and into the practice of creation itself.
Do you find that God comes in through, this is kind of, I don't know how you'll take this, but do you find that God comes in through your crown or in through your heart or in through your toes? Like, how do you embody this channeling? How do you, for you, like, do you have embodiment practices that you've started to work with or that you have worked with? Like, how do you crack open?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I'm trying to think of it as nobody's ever asked me that before, and I've never thought of it. So, and my sensation is that it's my sensation actually is that God is everywhere and comes in from all different ways, right? So, and that you actually need to be nimble and open uh, and willing to recognize what you're seeing when you see it, even though it looks different every time, right? So,
Yeah, to recognize what you're seeing when you see it. That that is an artist's way of, it's like really being able to draw exactly what you're seeing, not what you think you're perceiving. That takes an openness.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the same with writing. It's like to write exactly what you're downloading as opposed to what you think you should be writing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I'm curious about, I know this is a little tangenty as well, but I'm curious about AI, Chat GPT, like how is that sitting for you? Are you excited about it? Is it a creative tool that you work with, or are you just like, fuck, we are all fucked? Like what is
I
your really
mean, yeah, I think it's straight plagiarism. Like it's based on the things that other people have made. I mean, it's not working from thin air. Like the the stories of creation by God are something that's made out of nothing, right? And then I think humans actually to some extent create in the same way. Like AI is not looking at the world and creating pictures. It's looking at the pictures we made and chopping them up to make more pictures. I think that's a very different operation. And I also think that when humans make things, um, we are sometimes inventing them out of whole cloth. To some degree, when we tell a story, we tell it in the language our mother spoke to us most of the time. And we tell it about people that we actually know or people who are like people we know. So it is rooted in who we are. It's not made out of you know, the vast chaos of space before the dawn of creation. But it's a very different operation than what I think is a straight plagiarism of most AI and the unremunerated plagiarism of like so many authors who are not getting any money for this
for their
work
craft? Yeah.
that who knows how long that stuff is going to be used, right? Like it may be centuries that their stuff gets used without any compensation whatsoever.
Hmm.
While the companies who are creating AIs just scrape all of the compensation for it. So I hate it. I also think that there's very little that's all good or all bad, and I'm sure that there are ways that AI can help us. But AI just told me, Google's AI just told me that water doesn't freeze at 28 degrees because water only freezes at 32 degrees. It told me that like 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I also think AI is stupid, and I've seen it
Mm-hmm.
lie. Like I've seen it like
Mm-hmm.
straight, like it
Mm-hmm.
does straight make up things and tell
Sure.
you facts, you know?
So does
So
it's just like our brain.
yeah, yeah, frightening like our brain. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's a terrifying mirror of who we are, to the extent that like
Right.
the AIs that scrape the internet and then like fall in love with you and stalk you. I don't know if you've seen those stories, but they're like there's you know, that's all too human in some ways. But yeah, I
Thank
think it's
you.
something to be avoided. And I actually think it holds up a mirror to us of like what is important about being human. And we really need to lean into that. So
Yes, I think it's so fascinating how it's like everything's speeding up so fast. And so now I think there's this movement, this real movement to slow down
yeah,
so that we
yep,
can actually hear the inspiration.
yeah,
Yeah.
amen. And
Yeah.
that's the one, and it shows us how precious inspiration is because AI cannot do it. Like it has to scrape the artifacts of other people's inspiration to make anything.
Mm.
So,
So personal joy. So what does your dream creative day look like from start to finish?
oh, this is a good question. So I've always been dealing with the realities of life, not the dream life. But so it would just be a regular day for one thing. Like I think it's really important that your creative life happens in the context of daily life. So I'm real tempted to like put myself on a ledge in Capri or something like that. But like it would be in the context of my daily life. And it would be having a couple hours in the morning to like take care of myself, take care of my dog, go for a walk, and then come back and spend a few hours like a 2 hour, a solid 2 hour block working on whatever it is I want to work on or feel led to work on. And then an afternoon of exploration, right? Instead of work. Like, so instead of having like answer emails or do any other kind of paid work, just getting to explore, you know, for the next
Creative
project.
freedom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which would probably involve like a lot of reading, but maybe conversations with people, maybe
Mm.
museums, you know. So
What about music?
oh, I do love music.
We started
Yeah,
this with your
we did. Yeah,
song.
yeah, yeah. That's true. So I'm talking about life as a writer. Like, I mean, with music, I would just spend the day in the studio in Ann Arbor with Jeff Michaels, who's my favorite recording engineer and my little brother.
Mm.
So that would be, and those are always, it's interesting. Music, I feel like I have a lot more ideal moments with music than trying to write novels or
As the
books.
tortured writer.
Yeah. And also everybody wants to hear your music. It's just so interesting because right, I have this book that took years and then I have a song that I wrote like in an hour that we recorded in a couple of hours and like everybody wants to come to your show. Everybody wants to hear your song and nobody wants to read your book. So,
Well, I think that the people after hearing you share from your heart like this so vulnerably are going to want to read your book. I know.
well, I very much hope that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you had to, let's round this out with, if you had to sum up the message of your book in one sentence, what would you say about it? And why do you want the people listening to read it?
I would say that this book, the fundamental thought in this book is that art is coming from God. And that means that all of us can be artists when we welcome the spirit of God into whatever we're doing, whether that's something that people think of as art or not, and that that can transform both our lives and the world when we do it. And I hope that that happens more often. And that's why I hope you read the book.
Lovely. It's such an important mission that you were given to translate this into form. So thank you for making
Thank
the
you.
sacrifices and for having the discipline and for creating a space for the inspiration to come through. It's so important that you did your art, that you continue to do your art, that you continue to share it. And so many people have appreciated your art in so many
Mm.
ways, really, smart, intelligent, wise, creative, talented people have loved what you do. And I know that you're answering the call when you're doing this work. So thank you for answering the call.
Well, thank you. It's not something I would try to claim for myself, but it is what I'm trying to do. So I'm really grateful for those kind words.
Yeah. Well, it's so wonderful and lovely to meet you. And thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you. Thank you, audience. Thank you, listener, for taking this journey with us. I would absolutely, and I would venture to say, Carrie would probably like to know what you thought about what we were talking about. We would love to
Absolutely.
hear. So, please reach out, share anything, any questions, any thoughts, anything that you agreed with, that you disagreed with, that you thought was inspiring, that you want to add to the conversation. I would love to hear. And where can they find you? Where can
Uh,
they find your book?
yeah, so they can find me at careywallace.org, and there's also a website at disciplineofinspiration.org. There's a Instagram um, at the Discipline of Inspiration. It's got a bunch of really beautiful quotes by
I
artists on art.
I
Um,
just started reposting a bunch of stuff from that.
oh, so great. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very inspired. That Instagram page. Yeah, so
It's the
we'll
foundation. It's the foundation of the book. So
yeah, we will put that in the show notes. And thank you so much again for your time. I appreciate you, and I look forward to
likewise,
sharing this.
thank you so much for sharing it, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.